In 1719, Daniel Defoe published a novel about a castaway named Robinson Crusoe that would become one of the most famous books in history. But few people know that Crusoe is based on a real man whose actual story was far more dramatic and disturbing than any work of fiction. His name was Alexander Selkirk, a hot-tempered Scottish sailor who, in a moment of rage and pride, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On October 2nd, 1704, Selkirk demanded to be put ashore on an uninhabited island in the Pacific Ocean rather than continue sailing with a captain he despised. As he watched his ship disappear over the horizon, leaving him completely alone 400 miles from the nearest mainland, Selkirk realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. What happened to him over the next 4 years and 4 months would transform him from a civilized man into something barely recognizable as human, and would ultimately inspire the most famous survival story ever written. Alexander Selkirk was born in 1676 in the small fishing village of Largo, Scotland, the son of a shoemaker and tanner named John Selkirk. From his earliest days, Alexander showed a rebellious streak that would define his entire life. He was quick to anger, impossible to control, and seemed drawn to trouble like a magnet. His family tried to keep him in line, but by his teens, it was clear that Alexander was destined for a life far from the quiet respectability of village life. The boy who would become famous for his solitude was anything but a loner in his youth. Alexander was known for his wild behavior, his drinking, and his fights with other young men in the village. In 1695, when he was just 19, his rebellious nature got him into serious trouble with the church authorities. He was summoned before the Kirk Session, the local church court, for what they called indecent conduct with other young people. Rather than face the shame and punishment, Alexander made his first great escape. He ran away to sea. Life aboard merchant and naval vessels in the late 1600s was brutal, but it suited Alexander's temperament perfectly. He was strong, fearless, and possessed natural sailing instincts that quickly made him valuable to ship captains. He learned navigation, seamanship, and the art of survival in some of the world's most dangerous waters. But he also learned something else that would shape his future. He became a privateer, essentially a legal pirate operating under government letters of marque. By the early 1700s, Alexander Selkirk had become a skilled sailing master, the officer responsible for navigation and the handling of the ship. He had sailed around Cape Horn multiple times, fought Spanish ships in the Pacific, and accumulated enough prize money to make him relatively wealthy. But his temperament hadn't improved with age. If anything, success had made him more arrogant and difficult to work with. In 1703, Selkirk joined an ambitious privateering expedition led by Captain William Dampier, the famous explorer and circumnavigator. The expedition consisted of 2 ships, the St. George, commanded by Dampier, and the Cinque Ports, commanded by Thomas Stradling. Selkirk served as sailing master aboard the Cinque Ports, a position of considerable responsibility and authority. The expedition was supposed to raid Spanish settlements and ships along the coast of South America, sharing the profits among the crew. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. The ships were poorly maintained, supplies ran short, and discipline broke down. Worst of all, Captain Stradling proved to be incompetent, making decisions that Selkirk believed were putting the entire crew in danger. The tension between Selkirk and Stradling built steadily as they sailed through the treacherous waters around Cape Horn. Selkirk, with his years of experience and natural leadership abilities, increasingly questioned the captain's orders. Stradling, aware that his authority was being undermined, began to view Selkirk as a threat to his command. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. By September 1704, the expedition had reached the Juan Fernández Islands, a small group of volcanic islands about 400 miles off the coast of Chile. These islands had long served as a stopping point for ships rounding Cape Horn, a place to take on fresh water, repair damage, and rest crews exhausted by the brutal passage around the southern tip of South America. But the Cinque Ports was in terrible condition. The ship was leaking badly, her hull eaten away by shipworms in the tropical waters. Her rigging was falling apart, and many of her crew were sick with scurvy and dysentery. Captain Stradling wanted to make hasty repairs and continue their voyage, but Selkirk believed the ship was unseaworthy and would sink if they attempted to sail her much further. The disagreement between Selkirk and Stradling came to a head on the beach of what is now known as Robinson Crusoe Island. In front of the entire crew, the two men engaged in a furious argument about the ship's condition and their next course of action. Selkirk, his Scottish temper fully aroused, declared that he would rather be left on the island than continue sailing with such an incompetent captain on such a dangerous vessel. Stradling, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of his troublesome sailing master once and for all, immediately agreed to Selkirk's demand. He ordered the crew to gather Selkirk's belongings and prepare to leave him ashore. This should have been the moment when cooler heads prevailed, when Selkirk realized the enormity of what he was suggesting and backed down. Instead, pride and anger drove both men to a decision that neither had fully considered. As the crew rowed Selkirk's possessions to shore, the gravity of the situation began to dawn on everyone involved. They were leaving a man alone on an uninhabited island hundreds of miles from the nearest human settlement, with no ship traffic and no hope of rescue except by the rarest chance. Several crew members tried to convince both Selkirk and Stradling to reconsider, but both men were too proud and angry to back down. Selkirk's supplies were pitifully inadequate for long-term survival. He had his sea chest containing clothes and personal items, a musket with powder and shot, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, a Bible, and some mathematical instruments for navigation. He had enough food for perhaps a few days, some tobacco, and a small amount of rum. For a man planning to spend the rest of his life alone on an island, it was almost nothing. On October 2nd, 1604, as the Cinque Ports prepared to sail, Selkirk stood on the beach watching his shipmates make final preparations. Even then, he could have changed his mind. He could have waded out to the boat and asked to be taken back aboard. His pride wouldn't let him do it. Instead, he watched in growing horror as the ship's boat was hauled aboard and the Cinque Ports began to move away from shore. As the ship disappeared over the horizon, Alexander Selkirk realized with crushing certainty that he had made the worst decision of his life. He was completely alone on an island that he knew nothing about, with minimal supplies and no plan for long-term survival. The silence that descended on him as the ship vanished was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Total, absolute silence, broken only by the sound of waves and wind. For the first time in his adult life, the rebellious, hot-tempered Alexander Selkirk was truly afraid. The first night alone on the island was a nightmare that would haunt Selkirk for years to come. As darkness fell, the island came alive with sounds that terrified him. Strange calls from unknown birds, rustling in the vegetation that could be anything from harmless lizards to dangerous predators, and the constant crash of waves that reminded him how isolated he truly was. Selkirk had landed on what appeared to be a tropical paradise. The island was lush and green, with abundant fresh water, fruit trees, and what seemed like plenty of wildlife. But paradise became a prison when you realized you might never leave. The beauty of his surroundings only made his isolation more crushing. His first priority was shelter, but Selkirk had never built anything more complicated than ship repairs. He managed to construct a crude lean-to using branches and leaves, but it provided little protection against the island's frequent rains. He was cold, wet, and miserable, already beginning to regret his impulsive decision. Food became his next obsession. The island had plenty of edible plants, wild turnips, cabbage palms, and various fruits, but Selkirk's sailor's diet hadn't prepared him for foraging. He made himself sick several times eating unfamiliar plants, and quickly learned that survival would require careful experimentation and observation. The island's animal population presented both opportunities and dangers. There were thousands of goats, descendants of animals left by previous Spanish expeditions, but catching them required hunting skills Selkirk didn't possess. There were also sea lions on the beaches, huge, aggressive animals that could easily kill a man if provoked. Most disturbing of all were the rats, descendants of ship rats from previous wrecks, which had multiplied into enormous populations that made his nights miserable. But the worst enemy Selkirk faced wasn't hunger, cold, or dangerous animals. It was his own mind. The complete absence of human contact began to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself talking aloud constantly, just to hear a human voice. He would have entire conversations with imaginary companions, argue with people who weren't there, and sometimes break down in tears of frustration and loneliness. After several months, Selkirk began to show signs of what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. He spent days lying in his shelter, unable to motivate himself to hunt for food or maintain his basic needs. He considered suicide multiple times, stopped caring about his appearance, and began to lose his grip on civilized behavior. The turning point came when Selkirk realized that wallowing in self-pity would literally kill him. If he wanted to survive, he would have to stop being the person he had been and become someone entirely new. He would have to transform from a civilized sailor into something much more primitive, a true island savage who could thrive in this environment. What do you think you would do if you found yourself completely alone, with no hope of rescue, and only your own resources to depend on? Selkirk's transformation into something barely human is about to begin, and what he becomes will shock you. By his second year on the island, Alexander Selkirk had undergone a transformation so complete that his own shipmates would hardly have recognized him. The well-dressed, clean-shaven sailing master had become a wild man whose appearance would have frightened children and made civilized people cross the street to avoid him. His clothes had long since rotted away in the tropical climate, leaving him to fashion crude garments from goatskins. He had no way to cut his hair or beard, which grew long and matted. His skin was burned dark by constant exposure to sun and wine. Most remarkably, his feet had become so tough from walking barefoot on rocks and rough terrain that he no longer needed shoes of any kind. But if Selkirk looked like a savage, he had also developed skills that would have impressed the most experienced woodsman. He had mastered the art of hunting goats, developing techniques that were uniquely adapted to the island's terrain. He could run down goats on foot, chasing them across rocky slopes until they exhausted themselves. His accuracy with his musket became legendary, until his ammunition ran out, forcing him to develop even more primitive hunting methods. When his gunpowder was gone, Selkirk learned to catch goats with his bare hands. He would chase them to the edge of cliffs where they had no choice but to turn and fight or surrender. Several times he and a goat went over a cliff together, and Selkirk bore scars from these encounters for the rest of his life. On one occasion, he fell so far that he was knocked unconscious and lay helpless for hours before recovering. Selkirk's relationship with the island's other inhabitants was complex and fascinating. He waged constant war against the rats, which tried to eat his food and even attacked him while he slept. His solution was brilliant. He encouraged the island's feral cats to live near his camp by sharing his food with them. Soon he had dozens of cats serving as his personal bodyguard against the rats, and they became his primary companions. His daily routine was structured around survival tasks that had become second nature. He would rise at dawn, check his water sources, and plan his hunting for the day. He maintained several different shelters around the island, each suited to different weather conditions or seasonal changes. He developed an internal calendar based on the movements of stars and the changing patterns of plant growth. Perhaps most remarkably, Selkirk maintained his sanity by creating elaborate mental exercises and routines. He would recite every poem he could remember, work through complex mathematical problems in his head, and replay entire conversations from his past. He sang constantly, songs from his childhood sea chanties, and hymns from the Bible that had become his constant companion. The Bible wasn't just spiritual comfort for Selkirk, it was his connection to civilization and language. He read it constantly, sometimes aloud to his cats, using it to maintain his ability to read and speak properly. Without this discipline, he might have lost human language altogether. Selkirk also became an acute observer of nature, developing an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes, seasonal patterns, and animal behavior. He could tell by the behavior of birds when ships might be approaching. Though he was disappointed countless times by false alarms, his greatest fear wasn't death or starvation. It was the possibility of being discovered by Spanish ships. Spain considered these islands part of their territory, and Spanish sailors would likely have killed him as a pirate or enslaved him. Several times over his 4 years on the island, Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, and Selkirk had to hide in caves, watching from concealment as potential rescue turned into potential doom. By his 4th year, Selkirk had achieved something remarkable. He had not just survived on the island, he had mastered it completely. He was healthier and stronger than he had ever been, with perfect knowledge of every plant, animal, and geographical feature of his domain. In some ways, he had become more suited to island life than to civilization. But he had also paid a terrible price. He had almost forgotten how to speak properly, stumbling over words, and struggling to remember how to interact with other human beings. He had become so accustomed to solitude that the thought of human company actually frightened him. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible transformation. What happens when Selkirk is finally rescued will show you just how profoundly his years of isolation had changed him, and how difficult it can be to return to the world you left behind. The most surprising part of his story is still coming. On February 2nd, 1709, after 4 years and 4 months of absolute solitude, Alexander Selkirk spotted sails on the horizon that would change his life forever. But by now, he had been disappointed so many times by distant ships that proved to be Spanish, or by ships that simply sailed past without stopping, that he didn't dare hope for rescue. This time was different. The ship was flying English colors, and more importantly, she was heading directly for the island's anchorage. The vessel was the Duke, commanded by Captain Woodes Rogers, leading a privateering expedition that included some of the most famous names in maritime history, including William Dampier, the same man who had originally recruited Selkirk for his ill-fated voyage. As the ship's boats approached the shore, Selkirk faced a moment of profound terror. He had become so accustomed to solitude that the prospect of human contact frightened him more than any danger he had faced on the island. He had almost forgotten how to speak properly, and his appearance was so wild that he feared his rescuers might mistake him for some kind of savage and shoot him. When the landing party first saw Selkirk, they could hardly believe their eyes. Captain Rogers later wrote that they encountered a man clothed in goatskins who looked wilder than the original owners of them. Selkirk's hair and beard hung to his waist. His skin was dark as leather, and he moved with the quick, nervous energy of a wild animal. Most remarkably, he seemed almost afraid of his rescuers, backing away and speaking in broken, halting phrases. But William Dampier recognized him immediately. "This is Alexander Selkirk," he announced to the astonished crew, "and I can attest that he is one of the finest sailors who ever lived." Dampier's recognition probably saved Selkirk's life, as some of the crew were indeed unsure whether they had found a shipwrecked sailor or some kind of island savage. The reunion was emotional beyond description. Selkirk wept openly, though whether from joy or terror, no one could say. He tried to tell his story but struggled to find words, his voice cracking from disuse, and his vocabulary failing him. The sailors gave him clothes, but he found them uncomfortable and confining after years of wearing only goatskins. He had trouble eating civilized food, preferring the simple island diet his body had adapted to. Most disturbing to his rescuers was Selkirk's obvious difficulty with human interaction. He would start conversations and then fall silent, staring into space as if he had forgotten other people were there. He was nervous around crowds, and seemed most comfortable when he could retreat to quiet spaces alone. The gregarious, hot-tempered sailor they had known was gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost afraid of human company. Captain Rogers was fascinated by Selkirk's story, and spent hours interviewing him about his experiences. Rogers' detailed account of their conversations would later become the primary source for Daniel Defoe when he wrote Robinson Crusoe. Rogers was particularly impressed by Selkirk's physical condition. Despite years of hardship, he was healthier and stronger than most of the crew, with perfect teeth and remarkable endurance. Selkirk proved his value to the expedition almost immediately. His knowledge of the islands and his incredible physical condition made him an ideal scout and hunter. He could climb cliffs that other men found impossible and navigate terrain that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. But he seemed most at peace when he was alone on these scouting missions, away from the noise and chaos of shipboard life. The expedition continued around Cape Horn and eventually back to England, where they arrived in 1711. Selkirk's story quickly became famous throughout London and Edinburgh. He was interviewed by journalists, writers, and curious aristocrats who wanted to hear about his incredible survival story. But fame brought new problems for Selkirk. He struggled to readjust to civilized life, finding cities noisy, crowded, and overwhelming. He had trouble maintaining relationships and often retreated to solitary places where he could find peace. The skills that had kept him alive on the island were useless in London society, and the social skills he needed had atrophied during his years of isolation. In 1719, 8 years after Selkirk's rescue, Daniel Defoe published the life and strange, surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe, loosely based on Selkirk's experiences, but heavily fictionalized and romanticized. The book became an immediate sensation and established the castaway story as one of literature's most enduring themes. Selkirk himself never profited significantly from his fame. He returned to sea, unable to adapt to life on land, and died in 1721 aboard a Royal Navy ship off the coast of West Africa. He was just 45 years old, having lived only 12 years after his rescue from the island that had defined his life. Alexander Selkirk's story is ultimately about the price of pride and the extraordinary adaptability of the human spirit. A moment of anger and stubbornness led him to spend over 4 years in complete isolation, transforming him from a civilized man into something that barely resembled his former self. His experience raises profound questions about human nature and our relationship with civilization. Selkirk proved that humans can adapt to almost any environment, developing skills and instincts that seem almost superhuman. But he also demonstrated that such adaptation comes at a cost. His years of isolation left psychological scars that never fully healed. The contrast between Selkirk's real experience and Defoe's fictional account is telling. Robinson Crusoe portrayed island life as an adventure filled with resourceful problem-solving and spiritual growth. The reality was far harsher: crushing loneliness, gradual loss of civilized behavior, and a transformation that made returning to society nearly impossible. Selkirk's story also reminds us how a single impulsive decision can change the entire course of a life. His demand to be put ashore on Juan Fernández Island was made in anger, without any real consideration of the consequences. That moment of pride and stubbornness led to experiences that no human being should have to endure, but also to a story that has inspired readers for over 3 centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, Selkirk's ordeal gave the world one of its greatest literary classics. Without his real-life survival story, we would never have had Robinson Crusoe, a book that has influenced countless other works and established the survival genre in literature and film. What do you think about Selkirk's incredible story? Could you have survived what he endured? And more importantly, could you have successfully returned to civilization after such an experience? His tale forces us to consider what makes us truly human and how much of our identity depends on our connections with other people. If Alexander Selkirk's amazing story captivated you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of survival and adventure from history's most remarkable figures. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video about another person whose real-life experiences were stranger than fiction. Sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with the worst decisions, and sometimes the price of pride is higher than we can ever imagine to pay.